I've lost a friend recently. Seems like this is the year for losing friends. Some perhaps intentionally, some perhaps unintentionally, but actually, honestly, most intentionally. And in order to understand a little bit more about this friend that I lost, I needed to describe perhaps how I know this gentleman, because I'm not going to use the gentleman's name, but he does exist in a wide variety of noble ape bits and pieces. He first contacted me probably about 12 years ago, and he is, well, nominally a farmer anyway, in a remote part of the Middle East, where John the Baptist once baptized people in the water, and I've known him on and off. We've communicated via phone, but mainly via email over this period of time. It has been a very one-sided friendship. Through the past maybe 3 or 4 years, he's described circumstances where eventually he ended up with HIV, or at least that was his claim, a wide variety of other things. But it turns out, certainly that I've heard from a wide variety of other folk, that a majority of what this gentleman says is just fictitious, and basically he's some kind of spoilt guy in his 30s who lives on his parents' olive farm and basically spends most of his time doing next to nothing, surfing the internet, basically. And to be honest, I'm not really too fussed about losing contact with this gentleman. I was very curious. I just put to him one day that maybe he should put his efforts, rather than being spent in sending many page emails to me, into maybe condensing his ideas down in writing, or at least doing something formally, using the luxury of his life to actually generate something rather than just useless web links and, going nowhere narratives. And apparently this was the reason to end our friendship. But thankfully, friends sometimes zero sum. And I received a text message about 3 or 4 weeks ago from a fellow who I knew back when I was probably 11 or 12. Role-playing games are a very interesting thing, but as a boy of 10, 11, 12, when I found others, in fact, I know exactly how old I was because my grandparents were selling their house at the time, so I must have been 11. My parents at the time, I think, were still married or perhaps narrowly divorced by this time, or getting divorced. In any case, my mother's my honorary aunt, my mother's school friend, had a, not even really stepson, the fellow who she saw on again, off again for about 25 years. He had a son who was interested in role-playing. To say interested is not, was obsessed with role-playing games. And so, as a young boy, through a collection of ideas, the thought was that I, in my, 11-year-old self, should spend time with this 20-year-old man, perhaps 21-year-old man, and his friends. And I spent probably a few days with them on again, off again, starting with my mother's friend's house, which is still there, still beautiful, actually. I visited it only this year with my wife, and when I go back to Adelaide, which unfortunately is not as frequently as I'd like going to it. It's like a little hobbit house in the centre of Adelaide, very long, thin, wonderful smells within it, and just so much history. Anyway, so I met Matthew, I think his brother, and then his brother's friend, and then I spent time at his mother's place, and we were fast friends very quickly. He gave me a miniature, which I've since lost, but then rediscovered in terms of who manufactures the miniature, and have got the miniature again, and actually sent him in a little tin, the miniature. But he and I have been corresponding via text for, like I say, about 3-4 weeks now. Just on again, off again. He's discovered my podcasts, which, as a thing, is an interesting thing to discover, because I guess I don't know, it's interesting. He says my voice hasn't changed, but I guess maybe my voice had broken by the time I was 11. I think it was certainly around that time that my voice started to break. So anyway, I don't recall having seen him after, when I was 11. I still somewhere have a dragon, which is an artifact which I think I bought around the same time period, with its tail broken off, maybe even close to my podcasting. I'm trying something strange here. I'm trying to video simulcast as I podcast, so excuse the visual reference here. In any case, so Matthew and I have been corresponding for about 3 weeks, and through this correspondence he referenced that, we probably share the same politics. I don't ever believe that I share the same politics with anyone anymore. I don't have that view as being standard. I had another question from a listener, Mike King, that I'll do another podcast on, but I wanted to start by just outlining my political quandary, particularly in this country. And it rests simply in the fact that I refuse to support either of the major parties. In fact, really, I think all the political parties are just generally suspect. In Australia, and I knew Matthew in Australia, so my assumption is that he assumes that I have, standard Australian political sensibilities where you have to pick a team because it's compulsory voting. If you don't vote, you're not a human being, they'll throw you in jail. And I never picked a team. Well, it's not that I never picked a team. I really, really thoroughly disliked both teams. But not just that I really disliked both teams, I saw it as being a systemic problem. And I think my political analysis always returns to the fact that in any given country, the political parties typically agree about vastly more than they disagree about. And it really is very curious that people pick their teams with regards to political parties, because as soon as they pick the teams, there are already people that I don't really want to have anything to do with. And in Australia, because you have to vote, you have to be political, there's this kind of strange false politicization, which means certainly in my, broader social sector, I would, follow the ALP or the Labour Party, which is equivalent to the Democrats here and equivalent, curiously, to the Labour Party in the UK, perhaps. I mean, all these parties kind of float around. And it's always interesting meeting people here because they assume, well, clearly he has to be a Democrat. Well, so when Matthew says to me that we probably have similar political sensibilities, I don't know that to be the case at all. My view is actually what I've found, particularly with friends that have stayed in Australia and, become closeted Labour Party supporters and all this other kinds of curiosity, that they don't understand the legacy of most of the laws and most of the problematic issues in Australia are actually well rubber-stamped by both political parties. If you listen to Stone Ape, and I'm not in any way advocating that one does, but if you listen to Stone Ape, you'll hear at the end of Stone Ape the discussion with me and Heron associated with hold it, wait, I thought we weren't going to have any artificial dichotomies here, yet mysteriously you're supposed to vote Democrat, you're supposed to support the Democrats. And that was just the end of the line as far as I was concerned, and probably as far as Heron was concerned as well, because I refused to take that as a premise. Like, if you're going to be critical, systemically critical of the political system, that doesn't mean that you pick a side just at the end. You're just like, yeah, but really I'm a Democrat here. No, that means the entire system is broken. And when I found with Heron in particular, and I had this kind of quandary because I know a few Vietnam veterans, is the nature that both political parties rubber-stamped the Vietnam War. They both rubber-stamped the conscription. While the Democrats paid lip service, and even the Republicans paid lip service to ending the war in Vietnam, the practicalities of it was that they were both parties were so heavily entrenched in this thing. And if I look at the political parties in the US, that's the reason that I can't be either of them, right? They're all pro-war, They're all completely pro-war. Like, there are small numbers that say, oh, no, we're not really, or, yeah, but unfortunately, in order to affiliate yourself with those people, you have to affiliate yourself with all the other people as well. So, with Matthew's question, I just thought, well, I can't contradict him via text message. I can't say I don't know if that is self-evident that we would share political sentiments. All I could say is maybe you should listen to a Long Funk podcast occasionally. But yes, it is a really curious thing that the supposition is that you'll follow a political line, which is just completely artificial and completely arbitrarily thrust on you. My joy, my hope in the last election, the last federal election in the US, was that a majority of people would come to the realization that I have had for my life, that the systemic problems in the political situation represented in two completely reprehensible candidates would indicate to them that time was right to actually talk about systemic change. I created a podcast called This Comes Next with the sole hope that this comes next would be a mantra. Like, what comes next? Let's talk about what comes next. This comes next. That's the whole mantra in that podcast. Completely lost, unfortunately. I should probably note that This Comes Next is also coming to a natural conclusion, so maybe I could drop this audio in the feed just to say, hey, that's all, folks. Thank you. And I think I'm just going to leave it at that. But it is wonderful to reconvene with a friend of times past, particularly when I seem to be losing friends of times present with a certain degree of frequency. I think on a certain level, I'm just politically objectionable. And quite frankly, it's that spikiness which probably pushes a lot of people away. I have to live with that.